Welcome to Talk Across America. I'm Doug Miles, and we're here in beautiful Sarasota, Florida. Great pleasure to have joining us now on our book talk segment. And we're going to talk some vintage football, particularly if you're a fan of the New York Jets. Of course, they won one of the most important football games of all time back in 1969, 50 years ago. We just celebrated the anniversary of that. It's called Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl team that changed football. It's the history of that great game, what the players did then, what they're doing now. And we're joined by the author today, Bob Lederer, former New York resident, lives out in the Midwest now. He joined us by telephone. And Bob, good to talk with you. How are you?
Hey, Doug, thank you for having me on. And if I could just make one little addition to what you just said, it's not really a book just about the Jets because that game changed the National Football League, which we may very well get into, either in a big way or a small way tonight. But that's what makes this book really relevant, because I would venture to say that the average fan who's 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 years old has no idea, has never given a thought to, why is there an American Football Conference and a National Football Conference? Where did this all come from? Right. And it all came from the result of the postmortem to Super Bowl III.
Yeah, as we were talking about before we started the interview here, I just missed that one, so I didn't watch it live. I have watched it since. You can watch the game actually on YouTube now, so I have done that several times over the years, and being a sports guy, read up on it. But I saw Broadway Joe. Unfortunately, his last few years where he really couldn't do much at all. He was injured all the time. But boy, you're right. That team still 50 years later resonates in New York, and like you said, that really paved the way, even though the leagues were going to merge anyway, but it paved the way for the AFL to become part of the NFL.
And you just made two great points. I don't know if you did it on purpose or not.
Tell me what I said.
Number one, yes, it is a big deal in New York. And yet, I have noticed from talking to people in Kansas City, the Chiefs who won the next Super Bowl in 1969-70, and who have not won since, just do not hold that same regard for that team. And I got to tell you, if you look at the roster of the Kansas City Chiefs in 1969-70, there's probably a dozen guys who you can make a case for either already being in the Hall of Fame or who should be in the Hall of Fame. And one guy that jumps out is Otis Taylor. But you also made the point about Namath. The Jets, the year before they went to the Super Bowl, and this is what's in the book that I think is one of the great revelations of it, actually got the hospital reports of the condition of Joe Namath's knees. And what they were basically told by the physicians was, Joe's got probably 2, maybe 3 years, and then we can't vouch for anything. Yeah. And although he lasted until 76 or 77, his most productive years were over by the very, very early 70s. So the doctors were really on target with their prognosis.
Yeah, I heard him say that in one of those interviews they did with him. Maybe it was his biography that NFL Films did, that after he got that injury in college, he actually was injured at Alabama with that knee injury, and the doctor said, well, we'll give you 4 years, and he said, I'll take it. And that was the 4th year, right, that they won it all. So,
and that was his 4th year in the league. Yeah, exactly. But then he did a couple of surgeries after that, and the one in '67, they brought in a real specialist because Dr. James Nicholas, who was the team orthopedic surgeon, had been doing kind of experimental surgery on a lot of guys like Namath and like Boozer and Billy Joe and a bunch of other guys, and they needed to have somebody who really, knew the stuff inside and out about knees and all that sort of thing. And so they did hire this very, very, very high-profile surgeon on knees and such. And I have actually seen the doctor reports. We couldn't put them in the book for fear of, violating Joe's privacy. But it really does spell out to the management that, hey, if you're going for it, go for it now. And 6 months after that report came out, they went for it.
Yeah. It's almost amazing he can even walk today. I mean, with all the surgeries he had.
Well, I think he's had both knees
replaced at this time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
With today's technology, medical technology, he probably would have had maybe 8-10 years. Good years.
Well, yeah, but with today's technology, his knees would have been much more thoroughly checked out by both the St. Louis Cardinals and the New York Jets before they would get in a bidding war for him, and neither team did. The Jets first looked at the condition of his knees after he signed his contract, literally minutes after he signed it at a ceremony at a New York restaurant. Dr. Nicholas took him into the men's room, had him roll up, his pant knees, and that's when they really checked out his knees for the first time. But again, Joe is really not the focus of this book, and that's what I think really makes it a treat, for NFL and for Jets fans.
Yeah, you really you break it down. You have interviews and sections of just about every player that played in the game. Before we get into that, we mentioned you grew up in Flushing, New York, a stone's throw, as they say, from the old Shea Stadium. I guess you were a fan of the Jets at that time.
They were literally my backyard team.
Yeah.
I lived until I was 13 or 14 years old. I lived 2 miles from Shea Stadium. If you've ever been to the New York metropolitan area and out to the Old World's Fairgrounds, the Unisphere is still there, and I lived about a mile from the Unisphere. And later, in my teens, my dad moved us to another end of Flushing, and I calculated it for the book. It was about almost 3 miles from Shea Stadium. But I used to go into downtown Flushing and literally walk from there to the ballpark. In fact, I remember watching the park being built. I decided to do that one morning.
The Jets originally were the Titans, New York Titans, and then played the Polo Grounds, and then that was such a disaster. Sonny Werblin and a group came in, bought it, changed the name to the Jets, said we're going to make this into show business, and that's why they brought in Joe Namath, gave him all that money for the time, for what, $427,000, wasn't that the total?
Yeah, on the button, and that was at a time, and by the way, most of the money was deferred until after he retired, but
at
the time, at the time, Johnny Unitas was probably the highest paid player, and he was making $30,000 a year. So Joe technically was taking home $100,000 or more a year. Again, most of it was deferred. He actually was only cashing about $25,000 of it. But he broke basically the economic system that the NFL had in place with its players. And Joe Namath being signed by Sonny Werblin had many, many repercussions. That was one of them. Another one was it really put a tremendous stress in creating a merger, which ironically Werblin did not want to have happen except on his terms. He and Al Davis had basically gotten together and decided that, yes, they would merge with the NFL, but not if they had to pay the NFL to merge with them. And the other owners in the AFL didn't see it that way, and they were willing to, pay, over an extended period of time the money that the NFL wanted, because the Jets had technically invaded the Giants' territory and the Raiders had invaded the 49ers' territory.
Right. You almost look at what Broadway Joe Namath did as a parallel to, you can almost say, the Arnold Palmer of football. I mean, TV, the AFL on ABC first and NBC, because those games were on, in New York when the Giants maybe played on CBS, the Jets were on the AFL game, so that got good exposure there. And the Giants helped the Jets by not being a very good team after about 1964, right? So
that's actually it was 63. But Werblin, said he needed to find. He wanted the Jets to be a first-class unit, and he wanted the organization to be as first-class as what he said it was the case with the New York Yankees. And then he tied it even further and said, "But we need to find our Babe Ruth." And Joe Namath became, the Jets and the AFL's Babe Ruth,
right,
because he was bigger than life. Not only a very talented football player, but obviously a very charismatic guy. And he was the first real sex symbol that had an impact on the NFL. You know, Paul Hornung back then was considered a very sexy guy, but Joe Namath was the first player that actually got women to come to the ballpark and got women to watch the games on television. And today, from the data I've seen, almost 50% of the viewers and the attendees at NFL games are female.
Yeah. Yeah, he'd wear the fur coat and the sideline, right? I mean,
well, that's in the later years after you said after he was hurt, but yeah, all that ties together. But again, this book is really about the other guys. I make the point, and Namath has the second largest chapter in the book, but I make the point that Joe, for all of his talent and for all of his guts on the field, and he was a gutty player because he was a stationary target that every team tried to really get to, although they deliberately did not go after his legs, his knees. They would hit him high and try to break his ribs, break a finger or whatever, knock his helmet off and break his jaw, which the Raiders did. But they wouldn't hit him low because they knew that one good hit on his knees and that was it. His career was over.
Yeah.
And he was such a game changer for the league that nobody wanted to do that. There's even a story in the book there about him getting hit the year after the Super Bowl by Dave Costa of the Denver Broncos, and Costa going into the Jets locker room after the game. He had broken his ribs and saying, "Is he okay? Is he okay? I didn't mean to hurt him." And that's how important Joe was. But I set Joe up as kind of the nucleus of the team. And as great as he was, if he didn't have a great offensive line, which I, detail in the book, if he didn't have great receivers in Don Maynard and George Sauer and Pete Lamons and Bake Turner, if he didn't have a really competent running game and guys in the backfield that could block, and Matt Snell and Emerson Boozer and Bill Mathis, they could really block for Joe and for themselves. And if he didn't have the number one defense in the American Football League in 1968-69, there's no way that they would have gotten to the Super Bowl, much less given Joe the opportunity to guarantee that they would win.
Yeah.
And when you really look at it, no one player, obviously, in football is going to dominate a game that way because, I don't care if it's Namath or Tom Brady or Terry Bradshaw or Dan Marino. If there's a breakdown on the offensive line and somebody gets a clear shot at the quarterback, no matter how hot they are, they're going to be on their backside and out of the game before, very long. So this book is really a tribute to what I call everybody on the team not named Namath. And that includes also the coaches, because they only had a head coach and 4 assistant coaches in those days, and today they have about 20 or 25 assistant coaches.
You talk about, I'll get to the coaches in a minute, but Jerry Philbin was a guy that really was a team leader. You talk about him.
Yeah, he was basically the defense's Namath.
Yeah.
Now, he didn't have, the ability. He didn't have the star power. He didn't have the charisma. But Jerry Philbin was inspirational, right, because he produced so much on the field, particularly given his size, and he was an average 6'2", 245-pound defensive end. But in 1968, to give you an example, he had 19 and a half sacks. And that record held up as a professional football league record until Mark Gastineau broke it like a dozen years later. And, of course, Michael Strahan broke that record after that. So, that's how good Philbin was. And he was also fearsome against the run. He just studied and worked hard and looked at film and took every minute very seriously. And he was a guy that a lot of the other guys in the defense looked at and said, you know what, I want to be like him. I want to be able to play through the hurts and everything else the way Jerry Philbin can.
Yeah. You mentioned the coaches of the team, of course, Weeb Ewbank, who came over from the Baltimore Colts, won a championship there with Unitas. Then Sonny Werblin hires Weeb Ewbank. And I always thought Weeb Ewbank kind of gets underrated nowadays when they talk about the all-time great coaches. And I didn't get to see a lot of them, but just reading up on him, he seemed like the numbers are there as really one of the all-time greats, but nobody really thinks of him that way.
Well, he's he's not only the only coach that has won a championship in two different leagues, obviously in the National Football League twice with Baltimore, and then the American Football League, and then winning, the Super Bowl to win all of, football's championship. But he actually coached in the third league, which was the All-American Football Conference, which ran from 46 to 1950, and that's where the Cleveland Browns and the San Francisco 49ers and the original Baltimore Colts came from. In fact, there was an original Buffalo Bills playing in that league as well. He doesn't get enough credit in another way, and that is when he went to Baltimore in 1953, the Colts were dregs. They had nothing. And he not only put together, a team, but he coached up the players there and built a franchise, an offense and a defense that was really brimming with all NFL players. And then he went to the Jets in '63 after being fired by the Colts, and he did the exact same thing. He had nothing to start with when he opened up training camp in 1963. And in both places, Baltimore and New York, he set his team on a 5-year plan to become a championship contender in that time frame. And ironically, in both places, it was a 6th year where it actually took place.
Of course, he also had Walt Michaels, who eventually became head coach of the Jets, and Buddy Ryan was on that staff. So.
Yeah, that was Buddy Ryan's first professional job, and he worked with Walt Michaels on the defense. He was the defensive line coach and also the special teams coach, and Walt oversaw the entire team. And the book actually shows you the Jets' game plan,
right.
The first page of the game plan for the Super Bowl game, and you can see what they were telling the players. It's really quite eye-opening. And then they had two, very good offensive coaches. Cleve Rush was the offensive coordinator, and by the way, in those days there was no official offensive or defensive coordinator. They just called them like unofficial, or Cleve Rush's title actually was assistant head coach. And Joe Spencer was the line coach, and Joe Spencer is the one who really stressed over and over again to Weeb Eubank that they had to run the ball a lot and run it effectively in order for Namath to really be all that he could be with his arm.
And getting to the game itself, and I watched it recently again on the YouTube. It was up there, and it's a game where you think, Broadway Joe, one of the all-time great passing arms. Very little passing. They really went to the short passing, but mostly running the ball and working, the right and left side of that Baltimore Colt offense and keeping them off balance. And it really was a different type of game that the Jets have been playing up to that point, right?
Well, and that was one of the keys to the Jets winning the game, because if you looked at every pregame prognostication, which, by the way, the Jets were 18.5 or 17.5 to 20.5 point underdog, depending upon what your bookie was willing to give you. But everybody assumed that Joe was going to play his usual bombs away. And the Colts the entire year had not been beaten on a single long pass. They somehow have been able to blunt that. What the book really explains, and in some detail, is what a number of the different players told me about what they saw in the film as they watched the Colts, the offense and the defense, and what gave them confidence. In fact, while the rest of the football world was expecting the Jets to get blown out, the Jets were so brimming with confidence inside that famously Pete Lammons, the tight end, told Weeb a couple of days before the game, "You better turn off the film because we're getting overconfident." And one of the other players told me that Weeb actually listened to him and took it to heart, turned off the film, and they never did watch any more film of the game, because Weeb did think that they might become a little bit too overconfident. So this is the mindset that they went on the field with, and I think that's really amazing.
Of course, Jets go on to win it 16-7. Earl Morrall started for the Colts, coached by Don Shula, who would win a couple with the Dolphins a few years later. And Johnny, you did come into that game, but actually, he threw the only touchdown pass, right, for the Colts, but did not play well.
Actually, no, they didn't score on a pass. They scored on a run.
Was it a run?
But he was very badly injured.
Yeah,
it was not vintage Johnny Unitas. In fact, the Jets, almost to a man growing up, told me that Johnny Unitas was their hero. And here they were years later playing against him, not the twilight of his career, but near the end of his career, and an injured Unitas. And when he entered the game, a good number of them were somewhat nervous until he started throwing the ball. And then you could see it just wasn't, Johnny U. It was just another guy with a really bad wing. I want to ask you, since you said you watched the game.
Yep.
And in retrospect, do you think the Jets were lucky to win that game?
Yeah, I've read all sorts of stories over the years. I've read about possible fix in there and all that kind of stuff. Now I watched that game, and Jets had, like you said, like a Bill Belichick type of game plan, right? I mean, you put it by today's great coaches, and Belichick, it looked like he might have even drawn that one up, just like you said, little dinks and dunks and running the ball and keeping it off balance. So no, I think the Jets just knew what they were doing and had a plan, and they knew they were going to win before they went in there.
Well, Billy Joe, who went on after a playing career, he was a backup fullback for the Jets and a special teams player. He became the second winningest player in black college football history, coach in black college football history. And he told me that what struck him about the game is that people who called the Jets lucky because they had 4 interceptions and another turnover by the Colts on a fumble, failed to understand that when those things happen, when the ball is in the air and you've got a shot at it, you got to make the catch. The Colts actually dropped 2 Namath passes that went right into the arms of a couple of Colts safeties.
Right.
And I don't say it in the book, but I attribute it to the fact that several of the players told me that the velocity on Namath throws was so unusually hard that if you were not prepared for it, that it was very, very difficult to catch the ball. And I think that's actually what happened. If you watch those 2 interceptions, because both would have probably been run back for touchdowns, but they were dropped. And so, preparation and taking advantage, of the opportunities that are given to you are very, very critical to winning big football games, and the Jets certainly did it that day.
Yeah. Before we wrap it up, again, like we said, the game meant more than just, bringing a championship to New York. It paved the way again for, justification for the AFL. Of course, Kansas City kind of followed that up the next year by beating Minnesota, but really it was the Jets game that did it. How important was that as far as, I guess, the television contracts all kind of came together at that point, right? Pete Rozelle really needed almost the AFL to win, right? I mean, you talk about that.
Well, he didn't see it that way. He didn't see it that way until the Jets were finishing the Colts off, and that's when he realized that this was, and he did say it, this was the best thing that ever happened to professional football, right? Because it opened up whole new rivalries that didn't exist before. But the other thing that the game did, and we point this out, several of the Jet players told me that they had heard rumors during the 2 weeks between the AFL Championship game and Super Bowl III that if the Jets got blown out the way Kansas City had the first year and Oakland had the second year of the Super Bowl, that the NFL was prepared not to take all the AFL teams in because the AFL was considered so weak that most people thought it was going to take them 10 years to catch up with the rest of professional football. And so they were eyeing not bringing in some of the weakest franchises from the AFL. Well, far and away, the weakest franchise in every respect was the Boston Patriots. So imagine if the Boston Patriots had not been brought in, and probably would have had to not include maybe another one of the teams. And there's all kinds of possibilities there. But if the Boston Patriots didn't exist, well, maybe Tom Brady wouldn't be playing for New England today, right? Because there wouldn't have been a Boston Patriots. And I will equally argue that the NFL would have put another team in Boston eventually. Too big a market to ignore. But it would have certainly changed the way we look at football today. And the other thing that was certainly going to happen if the Jets had been slaughtered, because the plan was already in place. They were going to take the AFL teams and they were going to integrate them into the National Football League. And by that I mean the Jets were going into the Giants conference. Houston was going into the conference with Dallas. Oakland was going into the 49ers conference, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so there would not be an American football conference today. There would just be a very, very swollen National Football League, which is what the NFL was very fat and happy about having.
Yeah. Yeah, real turning point in history back 50 years ago, January of 1969, all really recounted well in this book, Beyond Broadway Joe, the Super Bowl team that changed football. We've been talking with Bob Lederer today. And Bob, I know you've been doing a lot of these interviews, and the book's been a couple of months, but boy, even though it's not technically football season, I know people want to read about the history of the NFL. They weren't around at that time. Do you have a website you want to direct people to? Or where people
Well, you can go to beyondbroadwayjoe.com. We have a lot of information there. We have a listing and a picture of every player from the team and a little highlight about their careers. So you can see exactly who was on that team and who we include in the book and some of the highlights of the book. And we have some reviews of both from professional book reviewers and from players who've read the book and from a number of fans. And the acclaim from Jet and football fans who have actually read the book has been very, very personally rewarding to me because we put in 3 years of hard work on this thing, and I consider it the definitive story after many, many books that have been written about Super Bowl III that really focused on Joe Namath. And so I'm proud about what this book is all about. In fact, today of all days, I saw another review of the book, and in it, the gentleman wrote that I had obviously done my homework, and I had not just written another book that was just focused on the same old stories about Joe Namath. That it is filled with stuff that you have never read before about that team, and I think that's worthwhile for both longtime fans. It's worthwhile for guys like yourself who have, who weren't even alive when the game was played. But if you're interested in pro football and if you're a Jet fan, I've got to believe that understanding the legacy of the league and of this franchise, and yeah, it's been 50 years since they won, but I saw them win, Doug. So I can say it can happen, and eventually probably it will. But, if it never happens again in my lifetime, I'll still go to my grave with a smile on my face.
It's a Jet fan is being like a Ranger fan, like myself. I get to see him win one cup, but I may never see it again. But
but you saw it.
But I saw it, and it's the same with the Jets.
Yeah.
Well, Bob, pleasure talking to you. Thank you for sending the info about the book, and I'm glad we finally got to do it today. I know it was delayed a little bit, but great to talk with you. Great to talk Jets football. I know you're out in the Midwest now. Do you still follow New York sports out there?
Well, yeah, luckily I came out here just at the right time when the technology enabled, people like myself to watch, a game from almost anywhere. So, yeah, on Sunday afternoons, I still watch the Jets, and, I've got a lot of hope about Sam Darnold because if you look at the time frame between Joe Namath and Sam Darnold, the Jets never drafted the number 1 rated college quarterback. Namath was, Sam Darnold was. Nobody in between was, and that I want to think is one of the reasons why they just have never found that replacement for Namath. And if they can keep Sam Darnold healthy, I think he can take them a long way.
I have to see if Adam Gase is the reincarnation of Weeb Eubank, though. I'm not so sure about that.
You're a Florida guy. You got to tell me how good a coach Adam Gase is.
Just peripherally, didn't follow him that closely, but I thought he did a decent job. Got him, playing pretty good. The Dolphins we're talking about, but just kind of fell apart last year. So you didn't get that long a time either there, So.
Well, like Eubank, he seems to be a quarterback whisperer.
He's an offensive guy, right? So
and Weeb was obviously a great molder of quarterbacks, because you don't get two guys who are that much better than Johnny Unitas and Namath. And Johnny Unitas was nothing. In fact, there's an interesting story about Weeb. He identified Johnny Unitas' ability by looking at still pictures of him throwing the football. I mean, he didn't have any film, and he was a free agent. They just looked at some still pictures, and he thought he saw something that he could do something with. And boy, he turned Unitas into a all-pro quarterback in no time.
Yeah. Yeah, and the only other thing, too, Adam Gase didn't have the greatest first press conference either. You know, that New York media, it's a lot different.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't know. I've talked to New York media guys about it, and I don't know who in the communications department with the Jets, because I have to assume this happened, sat down with him and prepared him for the New York media, which obviously can be ravenous and pretty nasty. But that first press conference was a disaster. But I listened to Michael Kay on, he does one of the sports talk shows in the afternoon up there, and this was like half an hour after the press conference, and you would have never thought it was the same guy. Adam Gase was glib. He could talk football. He could talk as a personal, matter. It just was a completely different guy.
Yeah.
So I don't know what happened, but I don't want to see the googly eyes anymore. I'll tell you that.
That's
right
real weird.
now.
Yeah, he'll learn, because especially if they don't win right away, he'll learn in a hurry.
Yeah, exactly.
Bob, real pleasure talking to you. Thanks for being with us. Beyond Broadway Joe is the name of the book, and Bob Lederer, Lederer, if you're looking it up online. And hopefully we can talk to you again down the road, maybe during football season. Love to have you back on.
Well, I would, I'd love to do that, because there's a lot of things that I learned from talking to all these people about professional football that I had no idea about. And I don't want to claim I'm a football aficionado. I mean, I watch all the Jet games, but I've been a fan since 1963. So I've got, I'm going into my 56th year of very, very hard fandom for a franchise that hasn't given me too many thrills.
No, but you probably wouldn't trade a minute of it.
No, it's been like the book. It's been a labor of love.
Thank you for joining us today on Talk Across America. Please visit our website at dougmilesmedia.com for more great interviews and content. And if you're interested in any of the books we talk about on the program, please click the Amazon link on our website. It helps support the podcast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you again real soon here from beautiful Sarasota, Florida.
I'm Stan Brock. 30 years ago, I formed Remote Area Medical to help people overseas. But then we found generations of families in America isolated by poverty from the health care they need. Together, we can take dental, vision, and medical help to 1 million adults and their kids, right here at home in the United States of America.